Hello, everybody. I'm Krishna Lewis at the Hutchins Center, and welcome to the first colloquium of the spring semester. And we are thrilled that Vince Brown is serving as our guest speaker. Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. is on his way from class and will soon be joining us. For now, please welcome current fellow Celine Lachey. She will introduce Professor Brown. She's a tenured research fellow in political science at the French National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, the author of several major publications in her field of race and gender in the French Atlantic. Professor Lachey is at work on Afrofeminism, women and emancipation, and it is to be published in 2023 by Seuil Press. Please welcome Professor Lachey.
Thank you, Krishna. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Vincent Brown, for having proposed my name to introduce you. It's really an honor. So Vincent Brown, Professor Brown, is Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is the co-founder of Timestamp Media. His research, writing, teaching, and other creative endeavors are focused on the political dimensions of cultural practice in the African diaspora, with a particular emphasis on the early modern Atlantic world. Professor Brown is also the author of numerous articles and reviews in scholarly journals. He is principal investigator and curator for the animated thematic map, Slave Revolt in Jamaica, and he was producer and director of research for the award-winning television documentary on anthropologist Melville Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness. Presently, he is at work on a short film for the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, which will premiere in late April of this year. Professor Brown's first book, The Reaper's Garden, was co-winner of the 1909 Merle Curti Award and received other major prizes. And his most recent book, the one he will talk with us today, Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, was awarded 8 prizes. And among those prizes, the Frederick Douglass Prize, the Harriet Tubman Prize. And we are all of us, very happy to have him today. I thank you all for being with us. And I thank Vincent Brown for speaking with us on his exciting project. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Celiane. I very much appreciate that generous introduction. And thank you to Krishna Lewis for inviting me to speak with you all this afternoon. And of course, thank Henry Louis Gates Jr. for hosting. And we look forward to seeing him during the Q&A. So let's start what we came into the Zoom room to do. I'm going to share my screen, speak for a little under 40 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll have a good long time for Q&A before I break out, sometime around 1:30 to go and teach my graduate class. So if I can share my screen here. There we go. Can everybody see what we're doing? I need one thumbs. Yes, excellent. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and guess that very few of you know that in 1776, Great Britain's most important colony was on the verge of insurrection. Colonists perceived that the government in Britain was conspiring against the rights of imperial subjects. They feared a plot against the English liberties they had long enjoyed. At their dinner tables, they heatedly discussed the merits of open sedition. Those disaffected with imperial governance dwelled upon the topic of American rebellion. As these Jamaican colonists debated liberty, their slaves saw an opportunity. The island was at a critical juncture with the British entry into yet another imperial war. Colonists traded exaggerated accounts of a French and Spanish military buildup in the Caribbean and calculated that there were 30 slaves to every white person, as they said, ready to join in the attempts of any enemy in a general massacre. On July 3rd, 1776, a regiment of troops left Hanover Parish for a rendezvous at Port Royal, scheduled to depart the island for North America by the end of the month. Throughout that parish, Enslaved people gathered frequently in houses, grounds, and open fields to hold what were called various serious conversations, which stopped suddenly upon the approach of anyone they did not trust. They were strategizing. Now or never, they thought, was the time to make themselves masters of the country. The moment seemed ripe for a successful uprising, but this American Revolution was not to be. As so often happened with slave rebellions, the plot was betrayed and the conspiracy unraveled. When the British in Jamaica considered the gravity of their predicament in 1776, rather than looking ahead to the loss of the 13 colonies on the North American continent, they looked to the past, back to the insurrection of 1760, which had been the most dangerous threat to the British Empire to date. They reflected on the differences between the unrest of 1760 and 1776, mostly in terms of the nature of warfare with their own slaves. In April 1760, an enslaved West African chief named Taki, or Tacky, staged a massive uprising against the brutal conditions on the island of Jamaica, then the most profitable of Great Britain's 26 American colonies. Over the next 18 months, as their numbers grew into the thousands, the rebels thwarted an initial crackdown, conducting a skillful guerrilla campaign against the might of the British Empire. Plantations were destroyed. Dozens of whites were killed. It was a war within a war. As Britain fought for imperial supremacy in Europe's first global conflict, the 7 Years' War, then raging across 5 continents, enslaved Black people fought to throw off the violent yoke of colonial rule. Shaken by the scale of the revolts, Britain's colonial forces eventually responded with overwhelming force, killing and brutally executing at least 500 men and women. Hundreds more were transported from the island for life, but the brutal British response could not contain the revolt's consequences, which included an amplification of anti-Black racism, the emergence of a movement to abolish the slave trade, and perhaps most surprisingly, a reorganization of the British Empire that provoked another rebellion on the North American continent a decade and a half later. 1776 customarily marks a moment in the origin of the United States of America, of course, when the Declaration of Independence announced the separation of the 13 colonies from Great Britain. When referring to the origins of the nation, though, the date obscures the broader context of the times. It deflects attention from the fact that Britain held 26 colonies in America, not just the 13 that broke away, and that by far the most profitable, militarily significant, and politically connected of them were those in the Caribbean. This chart here compares private wealth in various regions of Great Britain's empire in 1774. It divides the territories into England and Wales, British America as a whole, and then the 13 North American colonies that became the United States, those in the British Caribbean, and then it divides the 13 colonies into 3 regions, Southern, Mid-Atlantic, and New England. As you can see, colonists on the continent held nearly 70% of the wealth in British America, largely because the total population of property holders was much greater than in the Caribbean. But when you break North America down by region, you see that wealth increased as you moved south. That is, according to the degree the colonial economy depended on enslaved labor. And when you examine the average amount of property held per free white person, an astonishing disparity leaps out. In the British Caribbean, where some 90% of the population was made up of enslaved Black people, free white people were stupendously rich, boasting more than 17 times the wealth of those in the 13 colonies. Indeed, the average private wealth of a free white colonist in Jamaica, the single most lucrative American colony, was nearly 58 times greater than that of a similar settler in New England. Military deployments were distributed to protect that wealth. The Royal Navy kept its 3 main stations at Port Royal, Jamaica, established in 1696, English Harbor, Antigua from 1731, and Halifax, Nova Scotia after 1749, 2 in the Caribbean and 1 in Canada. Often there were nearly as many warships assigned to Jamaica as to the whole of the North American continent. Jamaica's planters and merchants wielded greater influence in the imperial metropolis than their North American peers, which goes some way to explaining why poor Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts couldn't get as much support as he needed as soon as he wanted from British policymakers when rebels rose up in that marginal colony in the 1770s. Before that American Revolution, the British were well aware that the event we now know as Tacky's Revolt represented the peak of imperial crisis, and slave revolt was generally a source of overwhelming concern. One planter who had lived through the upheaval wrote that whether we consider the extent and secrecy of its plan, the multitude of the conspirators, and the difficulty of opposing its eruptions in such a variety of places at once, this revolt was more formidable than any hitherto known in the West Indies. According to two slaveholders who wrote histories of the Jamaican conflict, one of them being Edward Long, pictured here, the rebellion was organized and executed principally by people called Coromantese from the Gold Coast, the West African region stretching between the Como and Volta rivers, who had an established reputation for military prowess. Their displacement, forced migration, and rebellion shows how the slave trade shaped what I call diasporic warfare, a kind of warfare that convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. The transatlantic slave trade spread people from Atlantic Africa throughout the Americas, and some who had been leaders or soldiers suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by currents and trade winds, and replanted in unfamiliar territories where they labored to rebuild their social lives. Inevitably, some of them determined that only war could end their bondage. This process of dispersal from a native land, transplantation, and adaptation to a new and strange one, is familiar to students of cultural change who have examined African religion, expression, and identity and their transformations by viewing African, American, and Atlantic history in a common frame. A similar approach shows how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life in plantation society generated a militant response that traveled, took root, and sprouted in rebellions that reverberated across the Americas and back to Europe. This is what happened when those called Coromantese broke out in a series of revolts and conspiracies in the 17th and 18th centuries, most dramatically in Cartagena, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, an archipelago of insurrections stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican insurrections of 1760 to 61, followed by further uprisings in 65 and 66, were among the largest and most consequential of these. From what observers could glean of the aims and tactics of the rebels, it was clear that many had been soldiers in Africa. Perhaps whole cadres of people arrived in the Americas with military training and discipline, or at least some knowledge of defensive and evasive tactics learned in Africa. Indeed, as some scholars suggest, American slave revolts might be seen in key respects as extensions of African wars. Viewing slave revolt as a species of warfare, then, is thus the first step to envisioning a map of Atlantic slavery that shows how political and military practices traveled, took root, and grew in disparate environments. Even as the slave trade forced people to remake and renegotiate their affiliations, the massive dispersal of Africans across the Atlantic scattered the seeds of military conflict throughout the Americas. The story of the Coromantese shows how African warfare was reconstituted, not as a direct continuation of previous struggles, but as an outgrowth of immigrant experiences. British slaveholders valued Coromantese highly. Planters stereotyped them as best suited for agricultural labor, and they had reputations for military bearing and discipline. They were often employed in command and supervisory roles in plantation work gangs, and sometimes played subservient roles in the armed forces, including the Royal Navy. But the British also said that Coromantese were particularly rebellious and prone to uprisings. They were dangerous people to keep in bondage, in part for the same reason slave traders found the Gold Coast to be an abundant source of potential workers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the region witnessed the transformation of major empires, Dinshira, Akwamu, Akim, and Ashanti, among dozens of smaller polities which vied with each other in the region. The battles that attended these contests produced great quantities of war captives for sale to the Europeans on the coast. They also produced a turbulent environment in which complex military campaigns involved both European and African rivalries, multiple alliances, negotiations, and treachery. In fact, people from the Gold Coast did not form anything like a single ethnic group in Africa. So who were the Coromantese then? According to the best research on the subject, they were members of a loosely structured organization of co-nationals who socialized with and aided one another, forming what contemporaries called a nation in the Americas. As a basis of social communion, in an environment where militarism was a common experience, national gatherings could also provide a forum for people to plan, organize, and stage revolts. When they did so, they drew upon their previous military experiences. However, as a category of belonging, Coromantese was cross-cut by many other axes of identification. Coromantese spoke more than one language and came from many different regions and kingdoms, from which they brought a variety of historical experiences. Just as importantly, once in Jamaica, they served different roles in the slave society. So no amount of cultural similarity could resolve all the difficult negotiations of multiple interests and experiences among them. Even with their compatriots, enslaved Africans made friends and foes through a politics of belonging that made the debate about what it meant to be Coromantese in Jamaica as urgent as the forging of the identity itself. In the face of continual assaults on their personal dignity, enslaved peoples distinguished themselves by their political commitments as much as by ascribed classifications. Among the Coromantese, different ideas of how to live in slave society, how to evade its worst abuses, and how to destroy it altogether shaped their rebellions even as they recalled their prior experiences in Africa. In the turbulent world of Atlantic warfare, nothing was more important than learning where and how to form loyal units, alliances, and coalitions in the face of superior power. The enslaved had won this wisdom through hard experience on the Gold Coast before coming to America, where they learned it anew and with different particulars in order to make war on their masters. I'm afraid our PowerPoint is stuck. I'm going to give it a minute. So I'm going to pause there, stop sharing and start sharing again to see if I can get our slideshow back online. There we go. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. Here we go. The former slave and Royal Navy veteran Olaudah Equiano famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was by nature a forceful assault to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of slaveholders. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" And it was not a rhetorical question. Since the early years of Jamaica's slave society, slaveholders had often considered the enslaved as irreconcilable and yet intestine enemies, made subject to the colonists only by the rule of the whip. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, when the island was still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how an entire world could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with Black people in other times and places, where the enslaved often characterized their bondage as a permanent state of low-intensity war, talking regularly about how they might wage that war. Now, this description might be more familiar now than it would have been a generation ago. Military theorists have become increasingly interested in warfare between great powers and improvised militias, conflict dispersed over wide areas and with largely undefined battle lines and blurred distinctions between civilians and combatants. These current trends in the study of warfare recommend a re-examination of the martial geography of Atlantic slavery too. Warfare migrates. This has never been more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to the transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to what I call a borderless slave war, war to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slaveholders. In this sense, Tacky's revolt was but a war within other wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it combined 4 conflicts at once. It was an extension of wars on the African continent. It was a race war between Black slaves and white slaveholders. It was a struggle among Black people over the terms of their communal belonging for effective control of local territory and the establishment of their own political legacies. And it was most immediately one of the hardest fought battles of the 7 Years' War, the titanic global conflict between Great Britain and its European rivals. Each of these 4 struggles emerged from different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. Charting their course suggests new stories of place, territory, and movement, a new cartography of slave revolt that braids together the histories of Europe, Africa, and America. As an example, one of the revolt's principal leaders, a man called Wager, also known by his African name Opongo, fought in each kind of these campaigns. He was an elite official on the Gold Coast, trading with British forts, and probably engaging in combat with political rivals. Captured and enslaved by a Royal Navy ship captain, he fought in naval battles against the French, alongside other Africans from the Gold Coast. He was one among dozens of other Black mariners employed at Jamaica who constituted about a quarter of all the crews plying the island's shipping lanes at the time. After Wager's discharge from the warship, he was a driver on that captain's sugar plantation, helping to keep other workers in subjection for a time before he came to lead an uprising that the British could fairly call a race war. As he engaged in these successive struggles, he connected the small scale of everyday violence in enslavement and coerced labor to the grand scale of imperial geopolitics. The hemispheric reach of these conflicts mapped interlocking patterns of state, commerce, migration, labor, and militancy. Across vast distances, these wars within wars connected the constituent elements of empire, diaspora, and insurrection. Such an integrated history of slave revolt takes us far from the plantations, beyond relations between masters and the enslaved, and outside the conventional locations for observing racial violence. Vectors of slave war in Jamaica formed a knot in the intertwined itineraries of soldiers who fought in Europe, North America, and Africa, sailors who crisscrossed the Atlantic world for merchants and empires, and slaves who were swept up in many conflicts on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I'm going to hope that the paperback is coming out in just a couple of days. I'm going to hope that you all will read it for yourself. So I'm not going to spend any time really talking about the revolt itself, but hopefully you can get a kind of gloss on it, a glimpse of it, the way it unfolded on these maps here that are in the book. I'm sorry, they're a little bit small on your personal screens there. If we were in a room using a bigger screen, you'd probably be able to see it much better. But if you get the book, you'll have them for yourself. For now, let me just sketch out what I think are some of the underappreciated reverberations of what we call Tacky's revolt, and give you a sense of why I think the insurrection was so consequential, and how I hope the book can model the kinds of connections that braid events in distant locales across long spans of time. Tacky's revolt anticipated the American Revolution by a decade and a half, and the Haitian Revolution by 3 decades. It can be considered one of the first great events of what historians call the Age of Revolution. And yet, it is hardly known outside Jamaica to people who aren't historians of the British Empire or Atlantic slavery. This is despite the fact that it influenced 2 of the signal moments of the era: the reorganization of British imperial governance that so irritated colonists in North America, and the early beginning of the movement to abolish the slave trade. So I'll talk about those now. In the aftermath of the revolt, to recoup some of the public costs, Jamaica's House of Assembly passed new poll taxes and commercial duties. The colonial government also committed to a tax on vellum, parchment, and paper ascertained by stamps. something that imperial reformers would attempt a few years later for all of America. The Jamaica Stamp Act of 1760 was meant explicitly to address the cost of the revolt. The duty continued in force until December 1763, when it was repealed as too great a burden for all but the wealthiest colonists. As a model for the more contentious 1765 Stamp Act that would rile the colonists in North America, the 1760 tax was an early local instance of a far larger reform effort stimulated by the 7 Years' War. As imperial policymakers celebrated military victories in North America, Africa, and the Caribbean, they contemplated the threat to their most vital colony. On November 7, 1760, 2 weeks after the death of King George II, the Board of Trade considered official accounts of the Jamaican insurrection, which raised the urgent question of how an expanding empire might contain its internal antagonists. In this liminal moment for imperial management, a new policy would take shape. British statesmen had worried over the governance of America for more than a decade, since the conclusion of the previous war with France and Spain in 1748. The colony's demographic, economic, and strategic value had increased dramatically in the first half of the 18th century, and the complexity of administering these colonies had grown in tandem. British members of parliament were spurred into a reform effort partly by the behavior of North American colonists during the 7 Years' War. Because in the midst of that conflict, colonial assemblies flouted the authority of local governors. Elected officials allowed flagrant violations of the Navigation Acts against trading with the enemy, and colonists often failed to supply enough local troops and resources to the war effort. As the historian Jack P. Green has explained, this coincided with a dramatic shift from an essentially permissive to a fundamentally restrictive philosophy of colonial administration. In London, amplifying the widespread conviction that the colonies had too many privileges and that those privileges ought to be reduced. News of the slave war in Britain's most profitable colony strengthened the policymakers' resolve. And in this, they were helped by a shift in attitude among colonists in Jamaica. Jamaican colonists had previously been as restive and independent as their North American counterparts. But the slave insurrection reminded slaveholders of the benefits of empire. They soon conveyed their gratitude, along with a request for more troops, to the new king, George III, and the Lords of Trade. The Colonial Assembly thanked the king. If not for His Majesty's forces, they wrote, quote, "the lives and properties of your loyal subjects would in all likelihood have become a prey to their slaves." Like North American colonists, slaveholders in Jamaica resented the influence of metropolitan intervention, as well as the imposition of new taxes. However, unlike so many in North America, their recent experience with slave revolt encouraged them to remain duly subject to imperial command, even passing that Stamp Act to help finance their security. They did not like many imperial reforms, but they acquiesced to them. After the 7 Years' War, with Jamaica having served as a model for the assertion of imperial control, policymakers preferred a raft of new legislation for the North American colonies. Yet, unlike colonial Jamaica's submission, these policies inspired the well-known backlash that would ultimately split the British Empire in 1776. If the Jamaican insurrections helped shape imperial policy toward the colonies, they also offered a rationale for the reform of colonial slavery itself. Fearing further rebellion, concerned Britons put forth pragmatic plans for enhancing the security of the colonies by limiting their dependence on the slave trade and ameliorating the condition of the enslaved. Ironically, perhaps perversely, the work of the planter historian Edward Long had a significant impact on a budding anti-slavery discourse. Long argued that slave revolt was a criminal trait of the Coromantee people, and his fearful hatred of Coromantees fed his loathing for Africans in general. Indeed, through a chain of association linking various unwelcome traits, Blackness in general came to signify the general potential for danger that Long attributed most specifically to Coromantees. In the end, regardless of their differences, Long surmised that Black people must actually constitute a different species of humankind. For this view, Long has been called an early proponent of scientific racism, which gained currency in the 18th century as writers sought to classify and rank the world's peoples. More immediately, though, Long's racism was as much a specific reaction to Black political agency as it was a general theory of human difference. His views projected his experience of the fragility of white mastery in the West Indies, where slaveholders had recently been frustrated, at times even humiliated in their attempts to pacify the enslaved. Though he thought that slavery was unavoidably necessary for the increase of English commerce, he viewed the African presence as an unqualified evil. One of the more enduring myths, of course, in the corpus of racial fantasy is that white people are underdogs, besieged by hypermasculine and ultraviolent blacks. Slave revolt engendered this trope. In his reaction to Jamaica's slave war in the 1760s, Long became one of the most erudite and prominent purveyors of racial panic, nurturing a virulent strain of nationalist discourse that would infect the political imagination of many whites down to the present day. In arguing that the principal threat to colonial slavery were African and especially Coromantee insurgents, Long promoted the idea that a native-born enslaved population would be more tractable. Long thought that if planters could avoid working their slaves to death, as they often did, attach them to estates rather than continuing to scatter them by sale, establish better conditions for child rearing, and encourage the progress of Christianity, then slaveholders might be more secure in their possessions. They could also save money on the ever-rising prices of imported laborers from Africa. Raising up native-born populations would facilitate what reformers constantly referred to as the improvement of the plantations, and would lead to a kinder and gentler and less menacing slavery. Through the beginning of the 19th century, people who campaigned against the slave trade would invoke Long's text to argue that ending the traffic would enhance the internal security of the British Empire. In this way, Jamaica's turbulence indirectly helped to nurture the emerging anti-slave trade movement. Now, fear of Africans had indeed inspired the first efforts to restrict the transatlantic slave trade. Responding to a 1712 uprising in nearby New York, the Pennsylvania Assembly imposed a prohibitive 20-pound duty on slave importation, citing what they called diverse plots and insurrections, not only in the islands, but on the mainland here in America, as the reason for their action. After a revolt near South Carolina's Stono River in 1739, the colony enacted a 10-year moratorium on the importation of Africans, but planters soon found they could not do without them. Amid news of Jamaica's troubles in the 1760s, other colonies tried again. Virginia's legislators attempted to levy increased duties on imported slaves in 1767, 1769, and 1772. As Virginia's governor explained to British officials, colonists had, and I'm quoting, just cause to apprehend the most dangerous consequence of importing Africans and should find means not only of preventing their increase, but also of lessening their number. He believed that the interests of the country would manifestly require the total expulsion of them. Influenced more by merchant interest than colonial concerns, London officials disallowed all three of these Virginia duty acts. But restrictions on the slave trade were more successful in Pennsylvania. In 1761, with news of Jamaica's slave war appearing regularly in the Pennsylvania Gazette, the colony passed a law to increase the import duties on slaves and extend its enforcement in perpetuity. In 1773, the Pennsylvania doubled the impost, and finally in 1780, the colony passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. As much as these laws might have expressed increasing opposition to the practice of slaveholding, and they did, they were also security measures aimed at discouraging the arrival of potentially insurgent Africans. If most white colonists feared the presence of Africans, many others empathized with their plight. In the abolition movement's early beginnings, African rebels often drew sympathetic responses, especially from people in places that held fewer numbers of slaves than the Caribbean. Many British and North American readers were more horrified by the brutality of their British co-nationals than by the violence of the rebels. Accounts of the execution circulated more widely with the growing popularity of sentimental literature and Christian martyrology, which helped the British to imagine their nation as a moral community founded in persecution, death, and religious virtue. For some, this imagined community extended to include the enslaved, however tenuously, and African rebels came to be seen as victims sacrificed to the cruel tyranny of slaveholders. One pamphlet that circulated during the 1760 revolt, J. Fillmore's Two Dialogues on the Man Trade, argued that given the terrors of enslavement, nature's higher law authorized violence against the enslavers. And I'm quoting at length here. All the Black men now on our plantations who are by unjust force deprived of their liberty and held in slavery, as they have none upon earth to appeal to, may lawfully repel that force with force, and to recover their liberty, destroy their oppressors. And not only so, but it is the duty of others, white as well as Black, to assist those miserable creatures if they can in their attempts to deliver themselves out of slavery and to rescue them out of the hands of their cruel tyrants. Now, few others are willing to go this far, at least in print, but the pamphlet influenced Anthony Benezet, the Pennsylvania Quaker, who laid the intellectual foundations for slave trade abolition in the British Empire. Although he avoided the topic of slave revolts, he frequently invoked higher law doctrine against the trade in human beings. Among his fellow Quakers, a fervent opposition to war induced them to see the violence stimulated by slave trading as an unconscionable evil. Their belief that the slave trade was a constant source of war was an orthodox line of reasoning through the early 19th century. And even some who could not condone slave revolt could condemn slaveholder tyranny. In 1764, a Boston writer asserted that West Indian planters were used to a cruel and arbitrary government over their slaves, having for so long, as he said, tasted the sweets of oppressing their fellow creatures. That sentiment reverberated strongly in James Otis's Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, published the same year. His defense of the rights of American settlers from the intimidation of imperial administration declared that colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or Black. In England, people mocked American colonists' pretensions to being oppressed by invoking their brutality toward the enslaved. In the early years of the American Revolution, the literary celebrity Samuel Johnson famously raised a toast to the next slave rebellion in the West Indies at an Oxford dinner party. By the end of the century then, stories of revolts against slaveholders and the gruesome executions of slave rebels had helped to promote an emerging anti-slavery consciousness, which ultimately enabled the campaigns that turned the British public against the slave trade and slavery in the 19th century. But all this happened too late for the rebels themselves. Like most slave insurrections, Tacky's war ended badly. The insurgents were killed or captured, publicly executed in grisly displays, or banished from the island, probably along with many other bystanders who had taken no part in the fighting. Looking back with a historian's perspective, one can see that the outcome was never really in doubt. The balance of forces doomed the rebellion from the start. The Coromantese would not win the colony from the British, as the North Americans would do two and a half decades later, and as a decade and a half later, and as the Haitians would do by 1804, taking Saint-Domingue from the French. But the rebels in Jamaica did not know they would fail. They acted with the hope of success. Even amid the business of war and enslavement, in a colony garrisoned for battle with foreign and domestic enemies, they could find fissures in the landscape of planter power, beyond the reach of the slaveholders' whips. They could even challenge the combined forces of the British Empire and find an enduring place in popular memory. Tacky's revolt and its reverberations through the 1760s represented a watershed in the course of Atlantic history. If regional political maps had been drawn by the wars that opened new territories for cultivation, stimulated the slave trade, and enhanced state power, the slave rebellions etched another record of historical movement. They channeled people into new solidarities and gave meaning to categories of belonging, partitioned friends from foes and bystanders, and redirected the priorities of governing authorities. Since Jamaica was the commercial and military hub of the British American Empire, its most profitable settlement and most powerful overseas military stronghold, what happened there was bound to reverberate widely. Yet the legacy of the 1760s is ambiguous. At the close of the 7 Years' War, Britain kept its prize colony, though Tacky's revolt helped to stimulate that imperial reform effort that provoked a greater challenge on the North American continent. If the Jamaican revolts in some ways anticipated the Haitian Revolution, offering a beacon of hope to the enslaved, they also left Black people divided. The Coromantes augmented their reputation as formidable fighters, helping to cast doubts on the wisdom of continuing the transatlantic slave trade, while at the same time strengthening the association between Blackness and social danger among whites. Even in the United States, as late as the mid-19th century, anxious slaveholders would refer to potential troublemakers as Coromantese among us. Perhaps the ambiguous nature of these legacies helps to explain why they register so faintly in the imagination today, beyond Jamaica. The Coromantese wars that shaped the era don't fit neatly into the prevailing narrative of the rise and progress of liberal freedom, even though such small, dirty wars epitomize the relationship between labor, commerce, and global capital, global power. They are obscured by the more obvious consequences of the American and Haitian revolutions, which seem to speak more directly to the Western history of liberty. The relative obscurity of these events is also due to the reluctance to acknowledge slave revolt as an act of war. Few things terrify the wealthy and powerful more than the prospect of losses to the poor and weak, which would signify a world turned upside down. Dominant peoples and nation states develop elaborate conventions for legitimating conflict, maintaining their honor in victory and defeat, and recognizing violence as a regular, if unfortunate, feature of political struggle. But between the powerful and those they dominate by daily habit, there is no limit to the lengths they may go to maintain their supremacy. They will commit atrocities and massacres, to be sure, but they will disavow them too. They will refuse to admit that their combatants are legitimate enemies, and they will denigrate the past and present struggles of less powerful peoples. Because slaveholders wrote the first draft of this history, subsequent historiography has strained to escape their point of view. What we must fully recognize, and what I hope I have conveyed this afternoon, is how events in far-flung and seemingly disconnected places had consequences in other ostensibly isolated locales. How the process of forced migration from Africa in a world of imperial warfare shaped the history of America in surprising ways. The uprisings of the 1760s in Jamaica can justly be narrated as stories of heroism and defeat. But in their courage and ingenuity, these insurgents also charted the landscape of force and its limitations that the maps of the powerful never meant to show. These counter mappings reveal a geography of hope and possibility in the making, fugitive territories carved out through political struggle that were difficult to maintain and are, in most cases, yet to be won. Thank you. And I think we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Fabulous. That was great, Vince. Marvelous.
Let me stop sharing here.
Sorry, I was
Hey,
late.
Skip, how you doing? Welcome.
I'm fine. I was coming from class, and then I've been chomping on my turkey sandwich while I turned on my screen. I didn't want to be.
I'm glad you're getting your lunch. I got to go straight to class after this.
I didn't want to be tacky. Oh. Questions, comments, Krishna, curate, please.
Silene, would you like to start, Professor Larcher? You have to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Vince, for your wonderful presentation. I began to read the book. I have two questions. There is one maybe you already answered, but I think it would be interesting for all of us to have a small discussion on it. If I understand well this idea of permanent state of war, considering slavery as a permanent slave of state of war, it introduced dynamism in the understanding of the agency of slaves, the relations, the power relations between slaves, masters, institutions in Europe, in the Americas, and in the Caribbean. But it seems to me also that we understand this permanent state of war as a structure that involves mostly males. So what role and what place do you allow to women in this general state of war? And my second question, and I will stop with that. You already started saying some elements in the end of your presentation. You complicate the distinction between defeat and victory, in the context of slavery. And to me, it's something very important for all the studies on uprisings in the Caribbean. And regarding that, this more complex understanding of defeat and victory, if I understand well, it's a military defeat, but in some way we can understand the Taki's revolt as a victorious project in the political sense. Then I would like to understand more for us today as historians, but also for people who are not specialists in the study of slavery, what is the meaning for you of the victory of the Taki's revolt, and in which sense it speaks to us today?
Yeah, both excellent questions, and I thank you very much for those. So let me start with the first question. We tend to think of warfare as a male activity. We're kind of primed to see it that way. When we imagine a typical soldier, and the soldier I showed you there was a man, we tend to think of militarism as gendered mostly male or almost exclusively male. Now, one of the interesting things I found when I was doing my research is that, at the beginning of the uprising in April 1760 on the north side of the island in the parish of St. Mary, the militia there managed to capture 25 rebels. And because the militia was so small in number, they couldn't really, spend a lot of their forces guarding these 25 rebels. So what they did is they put them aboard a Royal Navy warship that was just off the coast, right? Now, big bureaucratic institutions like the Royal Navy have to keep records. And whenever somebody is mustered aboard a warship, their names go into the muster. And so I was able to see the names of the very first 25 rebels captured in the course of Taki's revolt. And as we can see, 10 of those 25 names are identifiably women's names. So about 40% of those first rebels captured are women, and women are about 40% of the population of that parish at the time. So we may need to rethink, I think, what we think of as the gender of warfare, certainly when it comes to slave revolt. We don't know from that list what those women were doing, exactly what roles they were playing, but we know they were among the first 25 rebels captured. Now, I think that rethinking has been given a spur by writers like Thavolia Glimpf, certainly by writers like Aisha Finch in Rethinking Slave Revolt in Cuba, where they're not only kind of asking what different roles do women play in slave revolts that are not fighting, but Thavolia Glimpf has a lot of research on women soldiers in the US Civil War. And so I think we need to, and of course, there's Linda Haywood's great work about Queen Jinga of Angola. And I think we need to really rethink and do some more research on how women are engaged in combat in this period, certainly African women and their descendants. So I think that's an excellent question. You'll see I'm pointing in that direction in the book, and by no means am I trying to say this is exclusively a male affair. Now, the second question really gets to kind of the nature of how we think about what wars are, that they have discrete beginnings and ends, and that there is a victor, right? And a defeated, and those are readily identifiable. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad way to think about war. That has a use, it's useful for a lot of things, but I'm interested in something else here. I'm interested in a process of collective violence and what kinds of transformations that process entails in the world. And there, the question of who wins and who loses, when it begins and when it ends discreetly, is far less important than how those transformations play out over space and time. And so I had to bracket the question of the beginning and the end of the 7 Years' War to extend my understanding of collective violence to include that quotidian violence of slavery. And of course, we know from the massive surveys of slavery, like Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, that collective violence is always at the heart of enslavement wherever we find it, that slavery is always a violent activity. And we know from writers like Equiano and from the voices of slaves themselves that they think of slavery as a kind of warfare. So what I'm trying to do is take that perspective seriously. And when we see slavery itself as war, and that violence as an extension of the things we customarily think of as wars, we can connect up the 7 Years' War with Taki's revolt, with slavery itself in a way that allows us to encompass within our vision all these kinds of relationships and the transformations that they make in the world. Okay, two things there. One is that the 7 Years' War, for the most part, has been written as if Tacky's Revolt was not a part of it. The major study of the 7 Years' War, Fred Anderson's book that runs to about 600, 700 pages, doesn't mention Tacky's Revolt. This despite the fact that many of the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who fought in more famous battles of the 7 Years' War, as the Battle of Quebec, the Battle of Senegal, and the battles of Martinique and Guadeloupe, then go to Jamaica to suppress Tacky's Revolt. So it's the same war for them, it's just another deployment, right? Why would it not be the same war for historians? We know the answer because slave revolt is categorically defined as something distinct. And so we don't see those soldiers moving from one place to another, right? That I think is a category mistake, okay? The second thing is about kind of whether or not I see Tacky's Revolt as a victory. Not for the rebels, not in a way that could be defined by their particular war aims, but it is consequential. And what I'm trying to show is what are the consequences, the reverberating consequences of this series of events, right? For the transformations of the world over and above who won and who lost, right? Because even if you take these major battles, okay? So the British win the 7 Years' War decisively from the French, right? And then they have to reorganize their empire, and the North American colonists revolt, and it splits the British Empire, and 13 of their colonies go off and form the United States, and they lose decisively to the French. What did the French do? They so overspent to build up their navy in response to their loss to the British in the 7 Years' War that they were able to achieve this victory during the American Revolution, but the state goes bankrupt, and then when the Estates General meets to try and consider what happens to the state now, right? The French Revolution begins. And they lose their most prized colony in Saint-Domingue in Haiti as a result of the French Revolution, right? And the crack up of the state. So who won, who lost any of these campaigns? That's one question, right? We kind of know the answer to that. The more important question to me is what series of transformations are enabled by these violent events?
Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin Almer, would you like to present your question?
Yes, thank you very much. So Professor Brown, that was a fascinating overview of that seminal event. And my question is, do you have any thoughts on the role of the Jamaican Maroons in Tacky's Revolt, please?
So absolutely. So the Maroons are, a kind of fundamental feature of the book. Let's see how I could describe the role of the Maroons. I try to tell a long history of slave revolt that really begins in the mid 17th century and ends in 1800. So, this 18 months is considered in the context of about 150 years. And so what I suspect and what I write about in the book is that there are a number of slave revolts from the first British takeover conquest of the island from the Spanish in 1655. They were enslaved people who were revolting against the British, leaving the plantations, escaping into the mountains, and forming these escapee communities that we know as Maroon colonies. By the late 1720s, these Maroons are so harassing the British settlements, right?
Is Vince frozen or are we?
They break out into an open war.
Frozen.
Sorry?
You were frozen for a minute.
Am I frozen? Where did I freeze? Can you see me now?
We can see, maybe you can go back a couple of sentences, please.
Yeah, okay. So there's a first Maroon War in the 1730s where the British don't know they're going to be able to keep the island. So they sign treaties with the Maroons in 1739. And those treaties grant the Maroons their autonomy in their communities. But they also, by diplomatic treaty, require the Maroons to police future slave revolts in order to maintain their own autonomy, which they do. And so in 1760 and 1761, the Maroons are called upon as allies of the British colonial forces. And I don't think that the British would have been able to put down Tacky's Revolt as successfully as they did without that Maroon support, right? So this is the Maroons as Black rebels trying to maintain their freedom and doing what they have to do in order to maintain it. which is why I think, again, war and diplomacy is an important framework to think about slavery when one wants to understand this history.
So class matters.
Yeah, class matters, diplomacy matters, and alliances matter.
Thank you. Tanya?
Hi, I'm excited about your book. Just quickly back to Celian's question about gender. Even the names in the documentation might not necessarily point to what we might think of. It could also point to some people that we would refer to as trans. So just kind of that question in and of itself just opens up so many possibilities in terms of thinking about gender, you know, as a colonial ideological construct, whatever that has been imposed on the bodies of Black folks. And so it's totally not surprising.
Let me just interrupt you. I think that's an important point, because I just mentioned Queen Jinga of Angola, right? And it's important to recognize that Jinga gendered as male during a long period of time when Jinga was leading those forces. So, you know, warfare may still be gendered as a male activity, even when biological females are performing it.
Right, because like, you know, gender is determined by, depending on where, Ori, your connection to Orisha, whatever. But my question is just a personal interest. And that is, I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the reverberations of your work in terms of thinking about the Civil War, right? Is there a possibility that the North was terrified that they might get a Haiti on this border? I mean, or any other reverberations that you could just comment on?
Yeah, so always, I mean, I think the best book on this is Ed Rugemer's The Problem of Emancipation, where he looks at kind of how Americans, Southern American slaveholders received news of emancipation in the British Empire. Emancipation was precipitated in part by a massive slave revolt that happened in 1831, and consequences reverberated through 1832 and into the Emancipation Act. It's also the case that, you know, Southern planters read this, they were well-read people. They read the historical literature. They read historical literature produced by other slaveholders, including people like Edward Long and Brian Edwards, who wrote a lot about slave revolt. And so, like, you have to think of them as kind of not kind of insulated or isolated in their little Southern antebellum world, but as people who are thinking about the world history of slavery. And they see themselves as very much a part of that larger history. So the short answer is yes, slave revolt remained a fear in North America well into the Civil War.
Kate?
Thank you for this lovely talk. Listening to you reminds me of how beautifully you write. And I'm not through the book yet, but I appreciate getting the quick summary today. I have so many questions I would love to ask you, but I'm going to ask you. I guess I would love to invite you to riff a little more on the meaning of the revolt for the enslaved. I mean, it should be quite obvious on the face of it, but in another way, like the comments that you're making invite us to remember the contested political platforms kind of offered within communities of enslaved, and I wonder how you think about that, or how you address it, and I imagine that maybe this is a question about archives, and you might say something like, oh, you know, maybe we don't know this, or we can't know it, but I think a lot about some of the names of nations, the names of leaders as sort of can be glossed as political platforms, right? So I guess I just wanted to know more about the different contested meanings of revolt, of violence, to the participants, to those who stood and watched and didn't participate, these sorts of things.
Yeah. So I mean, kind of as you recognize, like, there aren't a lot of sources in which you can kind of really identify specific emotional, intellectual reactions at the time, but you have a few. I mean, there's one that I cite where there's a missionary, a Moravian missionary, who talks about news of the initial outbreak of Tacky's revolt being received kind of on the plantation where he works, where his mission is. And he says that, you know, the enslaved reacted with joy or trepidation as their hearts were inclined, right? which for me, the most important part there is to not assume that everybody reacts the same way. And I spend a lot of time talking in the book about why it is that people might not have joined the rebellion, right? Why it is that some did, but that was still a minority. Why it is that most kind of stood out of the way and tried to let it pass over, and why it is that some fought assiduously against the rebellion. So by their actions, you can see that Black people were on all sides of the conflict for various reasons, depending on what they thought the consequences of their actions would be. To me, the most important part of that is to take Black politics seriously, to not assume that we always already know what Black people are supposed to and therefore are going to do, right? And so we can raise the question and remind people that this always remains an open research question, even in the context of slave revolt in one of the most brutal slave societies that the world has ever known, right? We are still seeing political conflicts even among the enslaved, right? And I think to take that seriously is the real work of a historian.
Yes, remembering first and last, Black people, even enslaved, were human beings and as complicated as everybody else. That is the most important takeaway of this to me, other than your fact that you resurrect the importance of this and its relationship to the 7 Years' War. But it shows that Black people were complicated 200 years ago, man. You know,
Always have been.
Just like they were complicated in Africa, which is how the Africans ended up here, you know, I mean, among other reasons. So, well, great. How much time do we have, Krishna? We're going the full length?
We have about 20 minutes.
Oh, that's great.
I have
That's
to get down to my next class.
Oh, that's fabulous. Keep going.
Isauro?
Yes. Hi. I'm Isaura. I'm from Brazil. I live here in Boston, and I live in Jamaica Plain, and I'm a performer. I'm an African Brazilian dance teacher. And 2 years ago, I started to develop a piece, it's still in progress, that called Levante. Levante in Portuguese means upraising. So I still have to dig to list and recognize those upraisings that we have, mostly in Northeast and Northern Brazil. Mm-hmm. And I'm from Bahia. So, and I connected those information with the contemporary movement that we have. For example, the Blocos Afros. On the Blocos Afros in Bahia, Ileaê, Olodum, we sing and we dance a lot about those upraisings. It's a way to honor and teach our community about. So I'm curious, if you on your book, if you list, recognize, or spend time, words on those upraisings that we had in Brazil, and if you make any connection with also the acknowledgement of the construction of the quilombolas, that at that time, Northeast Brazil, we have the Quilombo dos Palmares, and that was one, and then started to develop. But today, in those days, we have more than 3,000 quilombolas community in Brazil. Even some with a large percentage of white people that, descendants of the white people that was betrayed by their own European government. So I would like to know about this, if you have in your book. And then also if you highlight or bring the presence of the women leadership on those upraisings. I'm searching for this, and I look forward to dig more on this, and I hope I'll meet you soon for some interview or something like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are all great questions. And certainly when we meet, I can point you to some of the literature much of which you're probably aware of on Brazilian slave uprisings and on quilombos in Brazil. And also kind of the earlier literature on Queen Nanny of the Maroons, who I think would be most interesting to you in your work, thinking about women leadership of these communities. So my book is pretty tightly focused on Jamaica and its larger relations with Africa and the British Empire in that 150-year period between 1655 and 1800, and doesn't spend much time on Brazil. And it's not a comparative analysis, so I'm not really spending any energy at all thinking about a comparison between the Maroons of Jamaica and the Maroons of Brazil. But that work is out there. You would start with Richard Price, who's got that fantastic book from the 1970s just called Maroons. That's a comparative study. You could think about Kenneth Bilby's True-Born Maroons, Jamaica, a more recent book on Jamaica. And then, the kind of literature on Palmares is pretty vast. So we can talk about that if we correspond later. But my book is not about Brazil in that way.
Okay, may I just one thing? I just want to acknowledge that today is February 2nd. It's the day of Iemanjá in Brazil that we celebrate. We should celebrate every day, but there is a power when a large group of people get together for something. So I just want to acknowledge this, and I also want to say thank you for you all. That I'm not going outdoor to the ocean, but how wonderful opportunity to honor Iemanjá, that Iemanjá back in Africa is Ogun River, but for us on the diaspora become the Atlantic Ocean. There is, this means a lot spiritually to us. And thank you. Thank you.
Sushma Raman.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Sushma.
Hi. Hey, Vin. How? Vanakkam. I didn't know your Tamil lessons had progressed. So
they haven't. I've known that word for a long time.
Vince's wife and I are from the same region of India. So I wanted to thank you for this fascinating presentation. I bought your book in June 2020, and I have it on my bookshelf. So this is a catalyst.
Well, now you don't have to read it.
No, I'm going to read it now. So it was really a fascinating bird's eye view presentation of the implications across the British colonies. And I'm wondering if you can comment. I understand that your book is really sort of a deep dive focused look, but I'm wondering if you can comment on the connections with uprisings and revolts that were occurring in other slave societies. This sort of picks up on the comment that was made by Ms. Oliveira just right before, but how did these revolts connect with each other across geography and language? So for example, Portuguese colonies or French colonies, and did they also influence anti-slavery movements in those other societies?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things I'm trying to do with this book is track the actual itineraries of individual people around the Atlantic world. So one can see, for example, right, in 1760, a number of the people that are tried and exiled from Jamaica are gathered aboard ships and they're sent to other colonies. And we know that many of these people are sent to what was then British Honduras, what's now Belize. And there was a revolt in 1765 in British Honduras, probably involving many of these veterans of Tacky's revolt. I was able to trace one other cargo of people to Virginia. And we don't know exactly what happened to them when they got to Virginia, but we know that they carried the news of this revolt to Virginia in 1760. Those stories were there and proliferating among the enslaved. We can surmise that by the fact that those people were there. We also know there was an illegal slave trade from Jamaica to Saint-Domingue, the nearby colony that was the most profitable colony in the world at the time, right? We also know that news of this revolt circulated in Jamaica for years and years and years. One of the stories I talk about is from the early 19th century, where a Jamaican planter talks about how some newly imported Africans rose up and attempted to stab their driver. And so he corralled all of them, interrogated them, and he learned that all of these Africans who were brand new to the island had been in contact with people on an estate where Taki's revolt had taken place some 40 years earlier, and they all knew about Taki's revolt, all these brand new arrivals, which means that there was a kind of oppositional pedagogy of the enslaved, right, being taught and learned on Jamaican plantations that extended 40 years before any of these people, had gotten there, and before most of the people in that area were born, right? That's interesting in itself. Now, I think that we can extend from that to the fact that all those people who were exiled from Jamaica to Saint-Domingue also told their stories in Saint-Domingue 30 years before the Haitian Revolution. That stories about what was possible in slave society and the kind of revolts that could be made and how to make them were part of the canon of understandings that the enslaved had with them in slave society.
Thank you.
John,
but beyond
John
that,
Adams.
right, what I'm trying to do is kind of trace very specifically who was where, what information could they possibly have brought with them from point A to point B, and what are the implications of that, right? And once we think about those implications, I think we can speculate a lot more about kind of what the relationship was between, say, Jamaica and Brazil, if and when there was one, right?
Yeah, and John Adams, Vincent, a letter in 1775 talks, it's the first, I believe, description of the grapevine among the slaves. And then when we add the fact that there were free Black sailors, and we've had other scholars done brilliant work, but not only Black sailors making their way truly on both sides of the Black Atlantic, and unfortunately even involved in the slave trade, but particularly on this side of the Atlantic, and not only Black people, white people. The idea that these enslaved people were somehow deaf, dumb, and blind is ridiculous. They were recounting stories, talking trash. Saying, "Man, I'm Cormonte."
in multiple languages.
In multiple languages, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Professor Brown has only a few more minutes left, so if you could keep your questions brief, that would be wonderful. David?
Yes, thank you for a marvelous talk. You did focus on Jamaica very especially, and I could see that. I'm just wondering about the other islands, because you've also got Maroons in other islands, and you've got, one would expect, more or less the same conditions of slavery, but in fact there weren't necessarily revolts. Is this somehow connected with the size and the scale of Jamaica? Because after all, Saint-Domingue is a very large and rich colony. Was it in fact easier to control a small colony than a large one?
Yeah. So the geography is important. I do spend quite a bit of time on geography in my account, because kind of as you're guessing, right, where you can escape to gives you a sense of what the opportunities are, right? Yeah. So for example, in an island like Barbados, where there are many slave revolts, in the 17th century, there are few slave revolts in the 18th century after the island is completely cultivated and it's largely flat, and there are very few places to hide. So kind of where you have mountains, where you have swamps, where you have easy access to sea lanes that we can get to other keys and islands and things like that, you are going to have more rebellious activity, or it's going to be happening in a different way. There are going to be more of those avenues of escape in a place like Jamaica, certainly than there are in a place like Barbados.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marcelo?
Thank you, Vince, for your talk.
Hey, Marcelo.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
I really appreciate your definition of slavery as a permanent state of war. I'm just wondering if we could use that concept to talk not only about slavery, but about colonialism and also the experience of free people of color in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and how we could even expand to talk about this permanent state of war and racial violence in the post-emancipation era.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I think that anti-Black militarism is a habit that's developed in slave societies. And I think, again, if we want to kind of speak comparatively, I think that's a habit that develops in Jamaica, develops in Brazil, it develops in the United States. Wherever you have that kind of racial violence as a kind of everyday part of cultural formation, that doesn't end when slavery formally ends, right? That becomes a kind of, an underlying kind of disposition, right, of the way a society is organized. So yes. Now let me kind of invert your question and critique myself, because I think it's always worth, because if you're asking me to extend this understanding of a low intensity state of warfare throughout all of these different kinds of societies, right? The question really becomes, okay, so if all of that is war, what's not war, right? So what I've done in this book is I've taken Equiano seriously, and all of these other Black writers who've said, like, yes, you can see slavery as a state of low intensity warfare, and asked, what do we see? What kind of connections do we make when we take that understanding seriously? What I cannot do is tell you what peace is, right, in this book. Because if everything is war, then I don't have much to say about where war ends, where war stops, and what its boundaries are. What I can do is kind of sweep everything in conceptually, but there are categorical distinctions we still might want to make that I'm not making in this book. So I think that's a caution with my approach that I would take and I would offer to you as well.
Thank you. Do you have time for one more question, Professor?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Tim.
Oh, thank you
Hey,
very
Tim.
much, Vince. This is great. I'm curious about the state of war as a framework for looking also at the Comantin populations. Have you come across a great deal of study on the composition of the Comantins? You identify kind of a geographic region that they're associated with, but within that, there's been a little bit more scholarship done within the Ghanaian historians on who were the makeup of the different groups along the coast and what their relationship was in a generalized state of war with the groups to the interior. And especially
chapters 1 and 3 are all about that, pretty much kind of internal struggles on the Gold Coast that are increased by the arms trade from the British. I mean, kind of one of the things we're trying to talk about here is this symbiotic relationship between the slave trade, the arms trade, and this increasing scale and intensity of warfare in West Africa that produces such great quantities of captives for sale. So kind of relations between African polities are a fundamental part of that story. And of course, I mean, I think you're thinking of Okusoa Purby, whose great book, Indigenous Slavery in Ghana, is fundamental, but also work by John Thornton, work by this book, Gold Coast Diaspora by Walter Rucker. There's some great work right now, and I'm drawing on all of that.
Right. And have you extended it all to the 7 years war impact in the Senegambia area? Because there is a point at which the British actually take over, as you know,
Yeah. So
in 1758.
So in fact, you'll see that one of the lead ships on the conquest of the Senegambia, right, is in Senegambia, and then they lose one battle further up the Gambia River, right, a battle with the Africans, and then they sail to Jamaica, where those same soldiers involved in the Senegambia campaigns wind up helping to suppress Tacky's revolt.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much, Vince. Great piece.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown. Your paperback is going to sell like hotcakes tomorrow.
Oh, that would be nice to see.
Thank you, Vince. You're
Thank you,
fabulous.
guys. Appreciate it.
Have a good class. Thank you, Krishna. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
See you soon, my brother.
All right.